Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Brotherton Lecture. My name's Professor Kristen Pammer. I'm the Head of Psychological Sciences here at the University of Melbourne. Yesterday, I visited the 65,000 Years A Short History of Australian Art exhibition, and it was absolutely fantastic. I really encourage anybody to go and visit it. It's only on for another month. Now, there we talked a lot about the importance of storytelling, how it builds connections and preserves knowledges across generations. And it struck me that with the Brotherton Lecture and other such lectures, we're doing exactly that. We're doing exactly what it is that the Indigenous peoples of these lands have done in art, story and song for tens of thousands of years. We're sharing stories of science to be accumulated, remembered and shared with the next generation of researchers. In this event is in keeping with the long-held and enduring practices of the traditional owners of these lands here in Naarm and across Australia. So in the spirit of storytelling and connecting present to the past, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. And I'd like to recognise that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are Australia's first storytellers, artists, scientists and creators. The Brotherton Lecture was established in honour of Dr. Patricia Leslie Brotherton, a dedicated lecturer in the Department of Psychology who passed away in 1979. Her bequest has supported this ongoing lecture series and the Brotherton Fellowship. And this lecture has become a long-standing tradition in our school, bringing distinguished researchers from around the world to share their expertise and insights, and this will be my first Brotherton Lecture, so I'm very much looking forward to it. So I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Beatrice de Gelder, but before that, first of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Marta Garrido, who will properly introduce Professor de Gelder. Professor Garrido, though, leads the Cognitive Neuroscience and Computational Psychiatry Laboratory and is the Director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Hub at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences.
Thanks so much, Kristen, and welcome everybody. Thank you for making such a meaningful introduction and acknowledgement of country. I too would like to acknowledge that our traditional custodians were making discoveries for so many years and also sharing knowledge, coming together to share the knowledge as we are today, and we are very privileged to follow upon that legacy. So I am really thrilled to welcome Professor Beatrice de Gelder and host her here in Melbourne. She has been a great source of inspiration to my own work, particularly her work around unconscious vision, and I couldn't be more happy to have you here. So a little bit about Beatrice. She is a professor of cognitive neuroscience in the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience at Maastricht University in the Netherlands and a member of the Maastricht Brain Imaging Center. She previously served as senior scientist at the Martinez Center for Biomedical Imaging at Harvard University. She holds MAs in philosophy and experimental psychology and a PhD in philosophy from Louvain University in Belgium, where she is originally from. Her research focuses on face and body recognition, the neuroscience of emotion and nonverbal communication, and more recently, the neuroscience of art. So she was fascinated about the beauty of this room, as I am, and I'm pretty sure all of us appreciate it. So her work has resulted in over 320 peer-reviewed publications and several books, including the book called Emotions and the Body by Oxford University Press. She has written for Scientific American about unconscious vision and its implications for understanding human perception. Professor de Gelder currently holds an ERC Synergy grant supporting her research on visual body perception and social communication. So about tonight's lecture, it will be about the body inside out, as you can read, from experience to perception and back. It's very intriguing. So Professor de Gelder will explore the science of visual body perception and how it connects to our emotional and social understanding. Her talk challenges conventional theories by bridging classical body perception with innate priors in the human visual system. She will discuss how conscious and non-conscious visual processes shape our ability to perceive faces, bodies, movements, and emotional expression, and what this reveals about the neural basis of social interaction and communication. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the real fun stuff. So this event will be a presentation style with about 40 minutes of the talk. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A session. So please keep all your questions and comments until the end. And then after the Q&A, we'll close up and there will be some refreshments outside, and you can further engage with the speaker and others amongst the audience. So without further ado, please, Beatrice, take it away.
Can I just...
Yes?
Is that a bit clear for everyone? Yeah, getting some nods.
Yeah, I thought so. Yes. Well, thank you very much for two wondrous introductions. Ill-deserved, of course, but let's see what we can make of them. Thanks you very much, Marta, for organizing this event. Thanks for the invitation to the school also. I've, of course, known Marta's work, groundbreaking work, for a long time. And it's always been very inspiring to be in touch with her. So you'll see some traces of that in my presentation and some other traces of other sources, which hopefully coexist nicely. So, I'm very short, so I'm going to be hidden behind the screen if I don't watch out. Good. Okay. I saw this, maybe you have seen also on a very recent cover of Science, which shows two bees that are in something I didn't know existed, not in an affective theater, but in an affective tunnel where where the researchers can measure to what extent their interaction, conspecific interaction, creates an affective mood, an affective state, such that, very interestingly, later on they have a more optimistic response to ambiguous flowers. I didn't have the time to look up what ambiguous flowers are, but it's a very intriguing kind of study, I think. And of course, the reason I'm showing this as a way of introducing you is to point to the topic of this talk, which is social interaction and how we engage into it, how much of it is conscious, how much of it is non-conscious, and how much the non-conscious part is important. Needless to say, but understudied, if I may point out, is the fact that we humans are very, very good at distinguishing small of major nuances in social interaction. Like this can either be playful or it can be threatening. And this is an old study actually, where we see in the brain how the social interaction nuances involving the same people, the same object, but slightly different movements, has a clear signature in the brain. So what does this mean, and what do we want to say about this? The kind of line I've been developing over time, over the last few years, is to look for markers as my B example already indicates to you, to look for markers of social competence, social skills, social perception, not in higher level social cognition processes, but to look for it actually in sensory processes. So to truly make it not social cognition, but social perception. Certainly social cognition is important, all those high order skills are very important, but there is a continuing debate, for example, even of the case of empathy, just where do we locate it in the, among the skills of humans. So this is one reason why my interest in the this perceptual side, which also phylogenetically is interesting, the perceptual side brought me. That was one reason that brought me to study body perceptions. Another reason, of course, was that there was very little literature on it at the time, and there still isn't that much. So this is an interesting picture. Where you see at the Salpêtrière, you see one patient brought forward for studying by all the very interested male trainees, interns, and the patient shows what is known in the literature as the hysterical posture. And that hysterical posture is actually, I didn't know that, I saw it only some years ago, is actually known through the literature and through art history. And this is, for example, a sculpture by Louise Bourgeois, which has exactly that hysterical. It's called the Arch of Hysteria. And it's apparently known under that label and in different cultures. This is like 500 BC, a sculpture from Mesoamerica, where you see the same kind of impossible curve. So virtually impossible body movements, like, for example, in pain, but also even more impossible than we have in pain. Is this called the Arch of Hysteria? Just to give you a very preliminary idea of how body postures have all over the cultures and all over the centuries been known to be important for communicating feelings. So most of my work, as Marta pointed out, what I'm going to talk about, is about bodies. And there are some advantages of working about bodies. One, in my view at least, body perception, emotions through the body are more automatic and are less dependent on attention. Because when you talk to somebody, you look at the face, and you non-consciously, as I will show you, non-consciously notice differences in the body, so-called body language, but that's outside your directed attention. With body expressions, there's also less focus on personal identity. It's less dependent on the viewer distance. You don't need to have somebody close by to see what their body expression is. You can see from a distance whether they are scared or afraid or aggressive. There's, of course, more of a link between action and emotion processes, which again points to the phylogenetic importance of emotion process for survival. And there is a new way of reaching into non-conscious perception and brain processes. So here's a bit of an overview, what I'm going to talk about. First, some applications, then some clinical cases of unawareness, then unawareness in the intact brain, then some neuroscience stuff about how the brain computes bodies, and I'll end up with the most hazardous combination of all this with virtual reality experience. This is an older image to show you immediately that areas known for processing facial expressions obtain just as well when you process whole body expressions. And as you will see, we always use full body stimuli, but we blank out the face in the most natural way possible. Okay? But we keep a normal outline of the whole body. Just the inner face is blanked out. In some early studies, we already showed that using this novel stimuli, namely body instead of faces, allowed us to characterize, for example, some differences between violent offenders and controls in a better way than just your classical face tests would do. there's, for example, in violent offenders, we actually did a study with people, with imprisoned people, and we found that there is confusion about emotions in the body expressed, which we didn't find. There were no such confusions in the facial expression recognition. So it overlaps, but it's certainly not the same, and it's certainly worth using that material as a test. As a consequence, we actually developed a face body recognition test for that kind of use. For example, something you can better measure with using bodies than faces is social dominance. Here, this one study we did where people have to saccade to the colors on the screen. This uses both faces and bodies, actually. They have to saccade to the colors on the screen when there is a change of color. And we see that the subjects that have a history of, that have a characteristic of social dominance will keep staring at even at the mask. This is non-conscious perception. At the masked bodies, as you see there in the display of stimulus mask, normally the task is to avert the gaze, but people with dominance will continue staring at the aggressive body, at a masked aggressive body. Of course, it's not just the body, because the body is combined with the voice and with the face. And we have shown we don't of course have time to look into that, but we have shown that using bodies provide a chance for complementary diagnostic tools in, for example, studies with hemispatial neglect, cortical blindness, autism, also in schizophrenia and prefrontal dementia. But that's not, we can talk about that later, but of course I don't have time to mention that kind of stuff. So, as I was hinting at already, there many of those. One advantage of working with bodies is that it's easier to create conditions of unawareness, because it's less natural, certainly in our culture, to pay attention to the body. We pay normally attention to the face. So this is you see what's going on here very quickly. Your task is to judge the facial expression, and not to pay attention to the body. You focus on the facial expression, you fixate on the expression, but we see that your judgment of the face is strongly influenced by the unattended body underneath that. And we see that this is a very early effect, that the brain is within a window of 100 milliseconds, is sensitive to the discrepancy, which something you don't notice in daily life, but I'm sure there are occasions in daily life when there is in fact this discrepancy between somebody smiling at you and in fact having a very cramped or a very uneasy or whatever body language. You're just not used to attend to that, but your brain certainly registers that. So that's without consciousness because of inattention. Of course, you all know non-conscious perception in a stronger sense, namely in the case of neglect, where we showed that the percentage of neglect in neglect patients is influenced by the presence of specifically a fearful or an aggressive body expression in the neglected field. When we ask here, in this case, we ask patients, very simple, we don't ask about emotions. Often we study body language without asking about the expressions. For example, here we simply ask the neglect patient, how many stimuli do you see? Okay? And when the stimulus in the neglected field, in the normally neglected field, is an aggressive body, then the patient is more likely to report that he sees two images. So that's the most radical case of perceiving without awareness is, of course, the one of cortical blindness. You may have seen this before. It's just always, there was a very nice, strong effect, which is always nice to see, comforting to see again. Here we used facial electromyography, which is, of course, not dependent on any verbal report. My personal view is, and we can discuss that later, that asking for a verbal report tends to diminish the effects of non-conscious perception. So here we see that if we compare conscious and non-conscious seeing, we see actually that we have an effect on the measurement of the EMG in non-conscious, and that effect is actually just as strong in non-conscious than in conscious. We have pupillometry results where the effect is even stronger in non-conscious than in conscious, and it's easy to sort of come up with a story that the explanation for that is that awareness dampens the kind of effect of that. Yeah, this is actually the pupillometry, where you see that pupil reaction to non-consciously seen, namely presented in the blind field images, is stronger than it is in the intact field. Good. So what about intact brains? What about because the dream of every researcher working on non-conscious vision and on patients is to see how much ideally of those effects you can replicate in the intact brain, and that is of course a complicated story because there are many differences in pathways, in sensitivity levels, etc. So we tried that out in intact brains, using this continuous flash and suppression paradigm, which is a bit of a tricky paradigm, but it can work. So here the task of the subjects was to report whether they saw a fear or a neutral body, and also to evaluate the strength of their percept. They had to choose between on a perceptual awareness scale, subjects had to choose between no experience, a brief glimpse, almost clear, and clear experience. And we wanted to know to what extent this was dependent also on the kind of stimulus, having as one hypothesis that for the fear body, the awareness threshold would be different than for the neutral one, but also to see which brain areas, whether the awareness was a gradual or a continuous phenomenon, and if it was a continuous phenomenon or both, whether different brain areas were involved in continuous awareness or in discontinuous. So you see here the different kinds of that. Blue is correct rejection, false alarm, miss and hit. You see that over the different awareness scales, with the most left one being I don't see anything, versus the most right one, I see everything. I see clearly what's going on. So you see that this looks that between awareness 3 and 4 it looks similar, but that before that you have the impression that is like a continuous phenomenon. Here the purple line would of course be dichotomous, and the purple would indicate that the phenomenon is linear. And this looks like evidence for a linear phenomenon rather than for a clear dichotomous one. Although it's a little bit different too. It depends a little bit on your viewpoint. But let's look at what the brain does with that. So here you see all the areas that are sensitive to perceptual awareness levels all together. And now we can look at which ones are give more evidence for their awareness being a matter of continuous, or for their awareness being a matter of linear increase. Okay, so you see here in purple circle you see the areas that seem to react in a continuous, in a linear continuous, in a linear fashion, versus the green ones are the ones that seem to be sensitive in a way that their sensitivity is a matter of a dichotomous awareness. For example, for interior frontal, for IFC there, it's not surprising that this is a matter of being dichotomous. Okay, for the visual it seems more linear. So what to conclude for that, from that, first of all, if you ask your subject for very nuanced responses, you get very nuanced results. So that would plead in favor of there being a continuum. On the other hand, I think that's a clear message from this kind of study is that that brain areas react differently. Some brain areas will have a pattern of reaction of activity that points to a continuous, increasing, accumulating sensitivity. Other ones seem to have on a dichotomous work on some more dichotomous-based criterion. I mean, there is a lot to this, as I guess you will all agree, there is still a lot to explore about these kinds of issues. Good. Let's now, I'll come back to that, but let's now go to something else. Since I've used, in all the experiments I've shown, we used bodies, the question is now, but how does the brain, when we go into detail, because even if with this awareness study, we use whole stimuli. We don't manipulate the stimuli such that we can look at parts, at composition, at orientation, or anything. So the next question is just how is the information from bodies processed at a pre or at a non-conscious level? And there are different possibilities if you look at vision science. Could be just posture, piece by piece, local form. Could also be simple velocity fields, interaction dynamics, angles, etc. So one thing I want to argue is that if we want to better understand what is involved in conscious versus non-conscious processing, and there is the majority of processing, in my view, is non-conscious. But if we want to better understand what's going on, then we have to go down to asking, what is it about the stimulus that is processed at which level in the brain? Okay? Because we cannot just ask the output level questions to the subjects, namely, is it anger or sad? Is it a body or an apple tree? We have to see at those pre-conscious levels, what are the representations? And of course, computational models, this last decade, computational models have been very helpful, not in solutions maybe, but certainly in suggestions about understanding what goes on at these intermediate levels, which we call mid-levels. So we tried out some approaches, two different approaches I'm briefly going to mention. One is straightforwardly addressing the question, what are the mid-level computational features? And how at the top we have a body, but somewhere in the many processing levels of the brain, we don't have a body, we have a decomposed stimulus that consists of God knows what, right? And the one answer we try to deliver to God knows what is mid-level computational features. So how do we get those? We get those by taking videos and analyzing them computationally, and then trying to map the computational characteristics of the stimulus we find, map them against the brain data. And this worked well for a number of cases. This worked, for example, very well for one of the features that's characteristic of anger movement, which is very sharp angles in the movement. If my arm is like this, it's more likely to be anger than if it's like this. Okay? So one of the features that the brain may use at this non-conscious level is, for example, here is limb contraction. So the goal is really to understand beyond the phenomenological reality of the full conscious experience, what's happening at the brain level, and how and can we get a hold of that? And maybe at unconscious we have evidence that the brain non-consciously sees bodies, but that's a misleading way of stating the thing. Maybe the brain does not make the brain independent of my conscious experience, does not see bodies. If it's a bit contradictory to formulate it, does not see bodies, but just sees patterns and angles and segments and things like that. And it's all put together in my conscious experience in ways we don't understand. But still, I mean, that's an important question. For me, it's an important way forward in understanding non-conscious perception, to see what elements the computations are done. Okay? And this, and you cannot do that by using common sense descriptions of the stimuli, and that's why we turn to computational redescriptions of the images and see how they map onto the brain activity. So that was one. Another one is to look at movement. Okay? Maybe the brain, maybe social perception is to some extent relying, or maybe initially at least, relying on grasping of biological movement, of specific biological movement. And we did one study comparing human and monkey bodies, and there we find that indeed the human brain is specifically tuned to the movement, to the movement of the human body, not just the kinematics, but to the overall movement. While the monkey brain is specifically tuned to the movement of the monkey body, independently of the level of familiarity of monkeys with humans and humans with monkeys. So there is something at that level of processing, and that's here you hear my interest in finding the social level of the social level at the perceptual level. So maybe the brain picks out, is fine-tuned to pick out human movement from all other sorts of movements because it's the most important, the most relevant, etc., etc. So that's not, it's not, mind you, this is not an area that does this, but this result was obtained by using completely bottom-up. We were not looking for areas. We used completely bottom-up approach to find this species specificity. Okay. Now, a different one is a different way, complementary and a different way is to look at, again, to look at what is characteristic about the body movement. We so far found a special case of, you could say, biological motion, but human-specific biological motion. A different way of looking at this, a complementary different way, is to look at the body parts and how they hang together. This is an illustration of my point, and what you see here is this is actually little ivory sculptures. There's absolutely marvelous ivory sculptures, that bits and pieces that were found in the burial site of Philip II, who's actually the father of Alexander the Great, in the border of Greece and Turkey, North Greece. And when I seeing this, I was wondering, I mean, how did they position, because you see those bits and pieces who were found among rubble, of course, how do they position them in the right position? What is needed here is some understanding of the biomechanics of the human body. I mean, we all know that the arm has to be on the side of the head, but not somewhere else. But you have to have some knowledge, some insight into the biomechanics to actually position them in the right way. If you look, for example, at the two arms of the middle character there, they could just have aligned them, or they could just have put them somewhere on the sides of the body, but they are real, and the knee also there is interesting. The leg and the knee, they seem to be like the knee there compared to Bob. Maybe that doesn't work, but you see it, right? I mean, you have the double one there, and then where the knee is compared to the arm, you can really fill in. You could trace lines and fill in a perfectly normal body, because the people who reconstructed that have apparently taken into account what I call the biomechanical constraints on the body movement. So we set out to see whether perception of biomechanical constraints was one of those, call it priors, call it perceptual priors, call it something, but I mean, we don't call anything innate anymore because that's out of fashion for now. It may come back, but could be one of the priors in the perceptual system that is there and alerts you to the presence of another human, because obviously the biomechanics for quadrupeds are different, and the monkey arm has different degrees of freedom. The joints have different degrees of freedom than they have for the human. So this would be one way of picking out a human. When I try to sell this story, people say, "But what about pain?" And I've worked with people work with chronic pain, and in chronic pain you get strange contortions of the human body. You never get to the arch of hysteria, because the body cannot do that. If the body does that, it'll break down. I mean, you ruin your back if you try to do that. Okay? And what I mean by biomechanical constraints is really movements that are mechanically impossible given the degrees of freedom of the human joints. Whatever pain you have, you will not make that movement unless you want to break your arm, of course. But that's and sometimes you see newspaper pictures of somebody in an accident, and you immediately see that the arm is in an impossible position. So we were wondering to what extent this kind of biomechanics perception, which we have very quickly and very accurately, would be also one thing at a non-conscious level that picks out bodies. Okay. Okay. So we set out to create stimuli based on motion capture. So you first have normal actors. You do motion capture. Then you have avatars. You have a skeleton. You have avatars, and then you can create, with some effort, you can create those biomechanically impossible movements. You see on the left side, you have movements of the joint that are biomechanically impossible, versus the ones on the right that are biomechanically perfectly normal. Okay, so I hope that's clear that the kicking is impossible on the left side, and the greeting, the hand waving, is impossible also on the right side. So counterparts are on the right side, the normal counterparts. So we wanted to know, what does the brain do with that, and can we actually find evidence in the perceptual system, not talking about the motor system, but in the perceptual system, that there is this sensitivity to what's biomechanically possible. Behavioral subjects are very good with that. They are very good at deciding which one is biomechanically possible or impossible. Puzzlingly, they are also very good at describing which action. When asked about the left side stimuli to say what action this is, people will still say it's kicking, and will still say it's. There is some doubt, but they're still like over 90% correct in defining the action. So there is some puzzling top-down, let's call it like that, top-down effect from action recognition on the judgment of biomechanical possibility. So this was actually high field, an ultra high field 7 Tesla study, where we tried to look. We used encoding, and we used different models. To make a very long story short, we do find that as you go from more posterior to more anterior in the brain, you see that the three key point model, the thing here, that's similarity distance. That's a different model, but the key point 3D model is a mathematical model of movement that is closest to a mathematical rendering of biomechanical possibility, and that model seems to explain best the brain data in lateral occipital temporal cortex when you go from posterior to more anterior movement. So this this is just one piece of evidence that allows us to say that the brain that the visual system, the mid-high order visual system, is sensitive to the specific characteristic of the body, which is its biomechanical characteristics. Okay. So in terms of to summarize so far, what I've tried to argue is that on the one hand, first, there is plenty of evidence for non-conscious processing of body like there is for faces, that we would like to know just what is then processed. I mean, what is critical what is critical, because you can see if you go from full, rich, phenomenal perception, do you go down to non-conscious perception, whatever way you implement that, then somehow the stimulus gets impoverished. Okay, I mean, it's a sort of naive idea that if you go down in earlier stages of processing, the processing is done on a less fully, less rich stimulus. So what we would like to argue that less rich stimulus still is sufficient to pick out what is the social information, and that it can do that based, for example, on some features, or on some on some properties of the body movement, like what makes the difference between mechanical possible and mechanical impossible ones. Okay? Because this question, of course, follows directly from the finding that we are sensitive to species-specific body movements. So that if you find that in the next question, what makes a human-specific movement? Not, of course, just the fact that there are 2 legs versus 4, but something in the movement. It has to be something in the movement, and that's something in the movement you want to find out about. Now we get into more troubled waters, because now I'm going to convince you, and I will probably not succeed so, in convincing you that that mid-level body perception is an important dimension of embodiment, but also is what is at stake in the success of virtual reality. Because virtual reality is a very strange phenomenon, and I'm not done with understanding how strange it is, because it works perfectly. At the same time, you are fully conscious. It's a little bit different from non-conscious processing in blindsight. It works perfectly, and on the other hand, you know it's all false and fake. Right? So what I'm going to show you is some phenomena that we know from blindsight and we know from normal perception, but are completely dissociative, let's call it. I like the term dissociative reality in terms of virtual reality, because it evokes a little bit a dissociative phenomenon known from neuropsychology, where the person lives in 2 dissociated states. Okay? So one study we did actually a while ago, and I won't have time to go to more recent studies, is this one. So what we do is you have virtual reality glasses on, and you're going to watch a video, and very importantly, you're going to watch the video under 2 different conditions. In one condition, you just watch it from a third-person perspective. Okay? It's just watching a video on. And the video consists of an aggressive person coming closer and closer to you. Okay? But in the other condition, what we call the first person, you are first embodied as the victim of the aggression. And embodiment is a standard thing in very many virtual reality experiments. It simply is that you stand in front of a mirror. In front of the mirror, there is an avatar. And what happens is you lift your arm, and the avatar lifts its arm. So there is that simple movement, of course, biomechanically possible movement. That simple movement creates a link between you and the avatar, and that link is strong enough, and the way that link is created is strong enough to get all sorts of effects, including amygdala effects for aggression that we know from the literature. Okay? And that's in a nutshell what I want to show.
Als ik op straat loop, zie ik niemand die er zo beroerd uitziet als jij.
So this is the aggressor, and you were spoken to as the sound is working, by the way.
Ik weet het. Je zegt niks.
So this is the
aggressor.
This is actually
je doet met opzet om het te graas te nemen. Om het te deprimeren.
You see the brain images online next to that.
Het gezicht van een bange hond. En dan te bedenken toen we het schouwden.
And then, okay, I'm not going to show you. It's a 2-minute clip actually, and then the aggressor comes closer and closer to you as the victim. Okay. That's very close by. Now you've got the idea. So what we did to understand the data is see whether we first found the threat perception network. All right. it on here. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we first define this threat based on the data. We find this threat perception network, and then what we want to see is it actually modulated? Is the effective connectivity in it modulated by the first-person perspective or by the third-person perspective? Do we find differences in the condition where you actually are embodied as the victim of the aggression versus third person where you simply watch the aggression? Okay? So just remind you, this embodiment is a very simple thing. It takes 1 minute. It connects you to this strange-looking avatar. We have also worked with completely personalized avatars, and it's still a debate whether that makes a difference. You can make a complete personal avatar of yourself and use that in experiments, of course. So what we find, and there's just one aspect of the data, what we find is indeed that the condition where you're embodied as the avatar versus simply watching the aggression makes a difference or not. We see that it makes a difference. It makes a bit of a difference whether you're a male or a female participant, because obviously what happens is an aggression between a man and a woman, so it's predictable that male and female participants will react differently to that. But you see very, very beautiful, very, very clear amygdala activity for the female participants when the aggressor enters the intimate space. We define it at social, personal, and intimate space depending on the distance from the. And even that is a bit, when you think about it, is a bit intriguing, that these notions about peripersonal space, that they work very well in virtual reality, even if you're just on a flat screen in a completely fictitious environment. Okay? So we find the same findings that people found in monkeys and in humans about the importance of aggression in peripersonal space coming into personal space, etc. So we do find that in and I still intrigued by that, because indeed you are in a completely impossible situation. Your brain knows that none of that makes any sense, and you just walk out. I mean, it's even more compelling than a dream, but you can walk out. So these effects, that's why I sort of try to push this notion that you can actually use virtual reality to find non-conscious processing. I wouldn't say full blindsight because there's no cortical damage, but that you can use virtual reality to tap into non-conscious processes while the person is fully conscious. And you may not, I'm happy to hear your disagreement with that. Good, and that's the last one. Going back to this strong social vision thing. Here, this is an experiment we just finished, which was a little complicated because it combines various lines of investigation. What we want to do here is actually, does it make a difference when you are alone in virtual reality or whether you are with somebody else? Okay? When we now move to not to Zoom meetings, but to complete VR-based meetings where we meet each other in an office space and you're sitting actually next to, I don't know if you've done that, it's quite striking when you are meeting somebody in an office space, but of course online. So we wanted to know to what extent is the presence of somebody next to you in virtual reality, is that also affecting your behavior? Like we know that in some circumstances, cognitive performance, affective performance is influenced whether you're alone or in a group, for example. So we created this virtual reality situation with a task. What you see there is a painting. We made 220 pretty horrible, artistically speaking, VR paintings. And subjects were in this office-like environment. I shortened this presentation in the interest of time. They were in this office-like environment, and the task, they were told, you look at the paintings, and afterwards you're going to have a memory task about that. Afterwards, they were going to be asked, have you seen this painting before or not? Okay, let me see. And there were, there were 3 social presence conditions. They were alone, they knew they were alone. They were together in the space with an avatar standing close to them at 1.5 meter distance or so. Another avatar, but that was a computer. They knew it was a computer-controlled avatar that made some movements, but more like ritual little shakings, or they were together in the third condition, they were together with a human-controlled avatar, namely with an avatar that was controlled by a human, just like their avatar was, and as a consequence, the human-controlled avatar would move in the room and would move to the sounds, etc., etc. Because typically, I forgot to mention, I didn't forget, but it's coming now, that we had sounds. So while they memorized the paintings, they were fed sounds that could be frightening or could be peaceful and that kind of thing. And what we wanted to know, of course, is to what extent the real presence, the condition of being alone in the room, of being together with a computer-controlled avatar, or being together with a real avatar, a real person behaving like a real person, would make a difference for their performance, and what we find, and I don't have time to go on to that, I will finish here. What we find is that that in most of the cases, that the presence of a human-controlled avatar had a strong effect on how the frightening sounds were performed. Yeah? We don't find a clear memory effect that cuts across, but for the EEG, I mean, I don't show the EEGs, no time, but for the EEG, for example, we see very clearly that impact as measured on the EEG of the alarming sounds is different depending on whether the subject is alone in the space or is there together with another human-controlled avatar. Good. So, where does this bring us? Let's go back to the bees. One reason why the bees were important, and I started with them, was to show that the bees don't have, as far as we know, don't have very, very many symbolic representations or very high conditions or very high cognitions or very complex considerations, mental life, etc., etc. And still, social presence has an impact on them, and that should direct our attention to finding out in humans also to what extent at this kind of let's call it precognitive level, this kind of precognitive level, social perception operates and how that is implemented in the human brain. And my pleasure to thank you for listening to me and gratifying you with graffiti I found on the wall in Lisbon, and that sort of intrigued me. It was very well done for an anonymous graffiti, and the message is, and you can lift the skull off and you can look into the brain, but then the body has its arms up and say, hey, what about me? So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the very insightful talk. That was fantastic. I have lots of questions. I want to make sure that the audience has time to go to their questions too. So please don't be shy. I did wonder about how do you know that a bee has positive affect?
Well, how do you know that another human has cognitive affect? Because of their preference for the measure is being used is the preference for after they have been together with another bee, they are asked to choose which flower they prefer, and they are given ambiguous flowers. And the ones that have been together with another bee are happy to choose an ambiguous flower as a positive flower. I'm sure you can replicate that in humans.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the way that people with autism process social cues, how much is known about that, and just the extent to which your work sheds insight on that.
We did a study on that a while ago, and it was at that time inspired by the notion that, by this very popular notion about all the miracles mirror neurons would do for you. And the notion was that people with autism were lacking or were low on mirror neurons. So we used body images to test that. What we did find that if you separate which the mirror neuron people, unfortunately in those days certainly didn't do, if you separate the understanding, the body posture from the emotion, you didn't find a difference with the autism. So the problem was in the affect recognition and not in the body posture recognition. I don't. There have been some follow-up studies, but that's the basic story. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I feel like there is a lot to kind of dive in on, but maybe one that you kind of glossed over or threw out as a supposition. I'm curious about your thoughts on why you think making certain emotional experiences conscious lowers their impact as opposed to when they're non-conscious. In some of the early work that you presented, you made the argument that making an emotional experience conscious. I think this was in the cortical blindness study. So when people could consciously perceive it, the reaction to the emotional stimuli was muted compared to when it was non-conscious in the blind space. Why do you think that is?
If I understand your question, I'm not sure I understood your question actually.
Potentially I could ask you this afterwards, but I think you said that like making an emotional experience conscious seems to dampen its experience compared to, or its impact compared to when it's non-conscious or not.
Why do I think that? Yeah, that's an intriguing. Why do I say that? But certainly, it's the case. It's the case in blindsight. We have found, and others have found, I mean, actually stronger reactions to, in this kind of autonomic measures, stronger reactions when things are not seen and when it's seen. But the general feeling is that certainly verbalizing non-verbal experiences sort of integrates them. Unless you have like shouts like I, ui, o, the moment the language sort of smoothens, spreads things out and connects it to, it's not an isolated kind of thing anymore that stands isolated in full primary strength, but it sort of merges with experiences and is calibrated, etc., like that. Wouldn't that be? I mean, that's in part what happens in therapy, as far as I can understand. To sort of you locate, you give a place to experiences in a wider network of. And there's some Freudian explanations of trauma also seem to hint in that way. You have the isolated pockets of experience are very strong, because like those disconnected from any background and framework, and bringing them back into the discourse.
Just a quick note on that. So. Spreads out across the brain. When he said using language spreads out the problem, do you mean spreads out physically across the brain, or what did you mean by that?
I mean spread out, not spread out across the brain, maybe literally, although part of that may also be true, but spread out across, integrated in the experience. Like you can have like a very sudden heavy pain, and that instant before you realize what the pain is or what might cause it, that sort of softens it, takes the edge of it. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I often have the impression that the body is like very much neglected in a lot of ways, not only in science but also generally. So it's really nice that you do this kind of research. And I was just wondering, what's your view on people becoming more and more disembodied? Like, for example, you have a Zoom meeting and you only see the top part of a person. Or people, like, I mean, the last experiment you're talking about where it's actually nice to have a real person compared to an avatar, which seems like a real person, but it isn't.
Yeah.
So, because I have the sense that humans are inherently social beings and they suffer if they don't have real beings around them. But yeah, it would be nice to hear your thoughts about that.
Yes. So I mean, I find it quite striking how people are willing to accept. Of course, I didn't talk about out-of-body experiences, which is an entirely different thing. But there's plenty of studies showing that. I mean, starting with the rubber hand illusion, of course. When you all know this, the illusion where you have a rubber hand replacing your real hand, and you feel the pain, although your own hand is not being touched. So those are very intriguing phenomena, testifying how willing, how you could say, how fragile the notion is that we are in our own body, and how that can be outsourced or outplaced to. I remember an old, before the mirror neuron days, there was this notion that me being a somewhat physically lazy person. The notion was if you walk with a backpack full of stones on your back, then you actually consume you consume energy. So you can be in your couch and visualizing yourself as doing exercise, and you will lose calories. I mean, I have not proven that point, unfortunately, but that kind of thing, isn't it? But I'm intrigued by the notion that virtual reality would be a means of tapping into the processes by which we are so ready to identify with an avatar and have amygdala activation, whatever. Those processes certainly show show the reality of the layers of functioning, of the solid layers of functioning beneath what we are consciously aware of. I was thinking, at one point we did an experiment with, in the very first blind sight study, we did that, and I'm still intrigued by it, and we could do it in virtual reality. We had the patient, and normally we give a alternative forced choice. Is it, let's say, is it happy or fear? Okay. What we did here was showing happy or fear, but giving the wrong response alternatives. We said, is it angry or sad? I don't remember exactly, but that's what we did. And the patient was very annoyed. I said, what are you doing with me now? And that was very interesting. So there is certainly some content and some emotional experience that takes place in the non-conscious perception, such that when you try to map it onto the wrong conscious label, something misfires. And that's so you could create that kind of conflicts, which are, I mean, conflicts are a way of entering into what drives the system, right? So that's be the.
Okay, maybe you take one last question and then we wrap up.
Hi, thank you. I had a question about the impossible movements and the recognition of that, and if there is any, I guess, basis for your research to go into I guess the rise of AI and the way that people are having difficulties recognizing fake videos, and that from your research, it says that we still do recognize the wave and we recognize the kick and things like that, and whether that perception is going to become smaller the more that AI videos become a part of our lives and we can't recognize the difference between them.
I don't know. I'm actually not aware of databases or image bases where people systematically try to extend the range of humanly possible movements. I think for now, but I may be wrong. I think for now it's rather all the computer graphics, etc., are doing is making it as realistic as possible. And when there is it's getting improving incredibly over the last couple of years. But even if it's a little less realistic, we are still willing to compensate and squeeze it into what is a canonical movement. Okay. Now, I think the actual constraints on body movements are pretty hardwired. I mean, I can certainly, a dancer can do many more things than me, but I don't think a dancer can go beyond the degrees of freedom of the joints of the shoulders, of the joints of the arms or the shoulder, without actually breaking down. So I don't think that like a systematic training, AI-driven training, where we extend and extend and extend those degrees of freedom would work. I mean, it's...
Is there scope to use, I guess, your research in the sense of combating how well we recognize what is fake and real online with our perceptions? No. No, because I think part of it is that the goal of the fake is to be as realistic as possible. Okay? And even if you look, one of the very difficult things to do in any kind of morphing, in any kind of creating artificial combinations, is the lip movements, the speech. And even so, and we know that from research from many years ago, that acceptance of the visual system for asynchrony between lip movement and sing is quite tolerant. I think it's around 300 milliseconds that we are automatically willing to compensate in our brain for the asynchrony. So we have that. You could read that as a very strong bias of applying or priors of human characteristics to cartoon or poorly made movie synchronization, etc.